So on my travels, which I've mentioned in the world, and I'm now in Australia, I met a man who impressed me very much. He's somebody who I think could help a lot of us who have got a bit stuck in life, because he's a man who embraces change. Well, so I thought to myself, right, we've got to find out how he does that, why he does that, and how it all happened. So I'd love you to meet the Reverend Dr. Lynn Arnold, former Premier of South Australia, and now an Anglican priest. Welcome.
Chrissie, very good to see you.
And you. So we want to know, as our change guru, how you've done it, how it's all come about, that you can, because life is full of change, and presumably you've coped with each one of those with ease.
Well, I hope I've coped well with each one of the changes. Others will say that story better than me. But the truth is that I was gifted change by my parents. I had wonderful, loving parents who gave my sister and I many things, but the greatest gift of all was the gift of change. And it manifested itself by the fact that before I was 12, I had lived in 4 countries and been to 8 primary schools. Now, there's a story behind all of that, and we haven't got time for that story now, but essentially what it meant was that my sister and I had to keep on adapting, learning to adapt, and my parents presumed that we had the capacity to do it. And so the reality was we did.
So when you turned up at these new schools, didn't you think, oh no, can't do this again?
I don't know that I ever said that to myself. I mean, I had to make new friends all the time, and sometimes that wasn't easy, sometimes it was easier than others, but I just took it as the way life was. I never really worked out the fact that most other kids weren't doing the same peregrinating around as I was.
Have you worked out what it was your parents did that made all this happen?
Well, for a start, I think they never took a down-at-the-mouth attitude about it. Oh, we're having to move again. It was always a case of, we're going on a new adventure. So we're going to now move to Canada or to New Zealand or to Australia. And in each situation it was, this is something to look forward to. Who knows what we're going to find? And I know when I was 12, there was the prospect that we might have moved again, and this time to Ghana in Africa. And I was so excited at this prospect. In fact, it was my killjoy grandfather who said, surely they should give us kids a break and have us stay in one place for longer. He was a real killjoy, but that's by the by.
Yes. But of course, for most people, I mean, you're saying really the influence of your parents was tremendous. And to that degree, a lot of people like you are very lucky people because it's positivity in your life and you grow up with that. But for many of us, that's just not the case. We have parents who have a particularly downbeat view of life and change. So the question of our chat today is, what are we going to do for them?
Well, it's a case also of people taking control of their own lives. So yes, while my parents gave me this framework, and my sister this framework in which to deal with change, we then had to work out the mechanics of that, what that looked like. So when we went to a school, how we made new friends, if we made new friends, or if we didn't make new friends in a certain school, how we found alternative things to occupy our time. And so it was, each of us has that inherent capacity, sometimes we don't know we've got it, to how we can then take on a different circumstance.
You really believe each one of us has that?
Oh, certainly each one of us has it. We were gifted with great capacities. We don't necessarily know that we have it, that's the point. And my parents helped my sister and I see it. I was a teacher in my early working career. One of the things I tried to do as a teacher was to help the kids understand they were not stuck in certain frameworks. I taught at a particular type of school that very often had people prejudicing the kids that this is your limited future. I spent a lot of my teaching effort to try and say that is not your limited future, it's actually this wide.
And did you see results from that?
Oh, I have some very impressive stories of kids who did take on the future differently to what they might have done had that message not been given to them.
Yes, it is very much about families, and some of us have been not gifted and we've had problems put upon us with difficult families, problems in our lives, like we've perhaps got an addiction, or we have a natural kind of propensity for depression, which are all negative. So what can you say to people like that?
Oh, well, I'm not saying I haven't had the negatives in my life. I certainly have. And in fact, the issue of depression is something that I have had as an ongoing issue at various stages of my life. In the last year in particular, it's been particularly severe. But I remember as a teenager, I had periods of depression. So that's part of the kit of living sometimes. And it's a case of how one handles that. It's a case of what help is available to help one handle it too for some people. I do understand that for some people it's much more serious.
Yes, it is.
Than for others.
And what we're talking about, of course, is this depression where we take to the sofa and we watch some daytime telly and we think, right, well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, it takes a lot to get off that sofa if you're very depressed, doesn't it? And so therefore you are stuck. So what can make you unstuck? Yes,
I mean, you enter into a sort of a toxic downward spiral where you feed on your own negativity and take yourself further down. And that really does require sometimes people helping you get out of that. But at other times, it also requires that one has looks up from the valley up to the mountaintop to actually take the perspective, where am I now? I am now in a valley. What is a valley, typical of a valley? It's dark. How can I look to the light? Look up.
Well, let's talk about the people who might help you or might not help you. Now, if you can afford it, you might find yourself a counsellor or a psychotherapist, because it may not be that your family particularly wants to see you changed.
It may be they don't particularly want to see you change. They may not actually also be the best people to see you change in certain circumstances. I mean, there are some situations where it needs somebody who is dispassionate. Dispassionate's a word I rather like. It's not tied up, not invested in the problems, can actually help somebody else see the problems more clearly. And I've benefited from that in my life sometimes, of having people who've not been invested in my problems, helping me see my own problems more clearly.
They were friends? Family?
Well, sometimes friends. I mean, I have to say, I've been a bit cautious about the idea of therapists and so on. I have seen them, but I've started from a somewhat cautious background on it because I guess sometimes one is doubtful.
We've been told that's the answer in our age, aren't we? In 2025.
Well, and I have found the value of them myself, but I started from a more negative background on the idea. What I think it's important to understand is that therapists, when they are at their very best, are helping people see their own inbuilt capacities for resilience. Where there can be problems is where they seek to impose solutions, and that's not good therapy. So the therapist at their best doesn't do that. When I was in World Vision, I for one period of time, I headed up World Vision Asia Pacific at the time of the Asian tsunami. That was a devastating experience. As you know, nearly 250,000 people that we know of lost their lives, and an unknown number of others perhaps on top of that. But for those who survived, they faced critical problems of survival, not only physical, but mental and emotional. And I was struck at the time that therapists from around the world volunteered their services to come and help, which was wonderful. And I thought this was great. Why don't we let them come? But those who were much more experienced in disaster work than I was said, can we just press the pause button for the moment? And I was a bit surprised by that. What we ended up doing was setting up child-friendly centres in the worst affected areas, Aceh and so on. And we just gave the kids the time to play. And in the process of playing, let them use their inbuilt resilience. And where we saw some kids could not do that, then we knew this was the child that needed extra therapy. If we'd have gone in too quickly, too soon with some of the other children, we could have actually pulled the rug from their own capacity for resilience, which is not a good thing. So therapy in its right place is wonderful. It can sometimes be premature.
But those children, what hope was there for ultimate change?
Well, I mean, a huge question, because their world around them had been totally devastated. And we're buying into a whole new topic here. And indeed, some of the communities, we were actually able to see the communities take on social change that was quite dramatic. They might have changed the way in which their society was organised.
Yes.
So people on the lowest caste, for example, suddenly getting a chance they never had previously, pre-tsunami, or people who had been simply cheap labour for somebody else, having a chance to now be cooperatively owners of their own fishing vessel, for example. In other situations, it wasn't as easy as that. But in every case, the future was going to be radically different to the past that they had lived.
Well, that's on a very much more parochial level. That's what happens with change. Sometimes it changes all sorts of things. Now, let's talk about people, for instance, who have addictions. So they manage with great problems to stop whatever the addiction is. But of course, something has to change there. It may be their friends, it may be their habits, it may be all sorts of things.
I think that's certainly a very important part, changing their networks, changing the context in which they are. But one of the other things that has to change is belief in themselves. I remember seeing a French movie back in the early 60s, and don't ask me the name, I've forgotten, it's too long ago. But it was a very moving movie. It was about an alcoholic. And one of the things he said to one of the other people in the movie, yes, you've taken away the alcohol from me, but you haven't given me anything in place of that. And essentially, addiction is an attempt to fill some gaps. And unless one can be helped to fill those gaps, then addiction actually becomes a tool of dysfunctional survival.
Yes, you rely on the next drink, or you rely on the next gambling session, or whatever.
That's right.
Because that's all you know. I mean,
well, it's a kind of toxic functionality. It is toxic, but it does enable some sort of functionality. And what you're seeking to do is create a new functionality that doesn't rely on the toxin.
Which, we have to say, I'm sure people are going to see this, will say is incredibly hard. We mustn't belittle it, because it is a change of life, isn't it?
Certainly it's a change of life, but it's also one of those, I mean, I'm not going to give easy cliche answers here as to what people should do, because I can't know their context, their circumstance. All I can know is in my circumstance that there have been some times when I've had to deal with the change issue, and I've had to make what I call a gestalt decision, suddenly click the fingers and see the situation differently. You know that image of the ink drawing of one moment you look at it, it's an old woman, and the next moment it's a young woman. Well, essentially you're seeing the same facts, but you have a gestalt moment and you see it differently.
Now, one thing that most podcasts and stuff online don't talk about is God. So I'm going to be radical, and since you are a man of God, a lot of people say, well, I don't think prayer makes any difference at all. It's, of course, a priest would say it does. But let's get you on change. Someone's stuck. Does prayer help?
Well, I think prayer does certainly help. I pray often, regularly, and I pray because I believe it helps. I pray also because I believe I need to be in contact with the divine, with God. Will prayer give me the answers I want? No. Will prayer help me resolve all the situations I'm in? In some longer term context, I might see the way it helped, but immediately I might not see that. And it's unfortunate that some people expect it to be the abracadabra kind of answer.
They do.
When in fact, what prayer does offer is a place to shelter. There's a psalm that I often cite, Psalm 61, verse 2. Lead me to a rock that is taller than I. And what that says is, don't expect there not to be problems that are going to be so great that you just simply want to shelter under a rock. God doesn't say, I'll take away the rock, take away the problem that's leading you for shelter, but I will provide the shelter for you, so that in this prayer space you may take some succor, some spiritual nourishment that will then strengthen you to face what will be perhaps an ongoing problem.
And we are talking here to people of very many religions, but the principle's the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be presumed, and I've been recently preaching on this subject of depression in the context of faith, it should not be presumed that people of faith don't reasonably suffer depression. And I've quoted in the most recent homilies John Wesley, who suffered serious depression, and Martin Luther, who had a nervous breakdown, let alone lifelong encounter with depression.
So if we could just talk about the people in, somebody's watching this who's desperate that someone in their life changes their attitude, changes their habits, makes positive change and stops being stuck. So what do we say to the person who desperately wants that? Should they, at what point do they leave? Do they give up and say this person's not going to change?
Well, first of all, one has to understand it is very difficult to let go of what lifeboat you're hanging on to. And we've talked about that it's difficult to let go of an addiction. Addiction can be a lifeboat, and you're being asked to let go of it. So you have to have them see that there is another lifeboat out there to which you can grasp hold. For somebody walking alongside somebody in that situation, their task is to help that happen, but sometimes it's too difficult for them to be able to do that. And I guess that's an individual encounter every person has to decide for themselves.
But earlier you said we all have it in us.
Of course we do.
So some of these people are saying, oh, well, I'm not going to do that, can't be bothered, I'll stay on the sofa. What about them?
They still have it within them. They're just refusing to look in that space. Comfort zones can be very uncomfortable, but they're still a comfort zone.
Yes.
I can at least be on this sofa and lying there, and I'll still be lying here in 5 minutes, so that bit's been safe. I can be just glued hypnotically to the TV, I'll still be doing that in 5 minutes, so that bit, to one sense of safe, is safe. It's a case of saying, but it's not enough. I can do more than that. And having them self-interrogate themselves to say, I can do more than that.
Well, I think it's also about saying, let's take small steps. So they talk about this a lot in the professionals. They talk about small, measurable chunks. Achievable.
Yeah.
I think there's something called SMART. They talk about specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time-bound. Yeah. So, which all sounds a bit high-flown for me.
We've always got to have acronyms. So
in simple terms, you gotta, if you're going to change, and you're saying it's certainly possible for all of us to get out of that stuckness, we have to make it possible in small chunks.
I like that very much, because I can cite two stories here. One is I walked Kokoda, which is not going to be known to many of your listeners, but it is considered one of the 10 toughest treks in the world. It was a 92-kilometre trek through hill and dale, that put it mildly. It was through mountain peaks and deep valleys and raging rivers. It was quite horrendous, frankly. But one of the things they told us as we would climb each step, going up a horrendous climb or down a descent, don't look at the top, it'll put you off. Look at your feet, go step by step. And there was a lot of truth to that. And then finally, if you did that long enough, then finally you could say, now I can look there. I can do that. I've done that before. I've done it by little steps. But even before Kokoda, there was another example in my life where small steps was a key ingredient of a path to success. I was about 12 years ago what one might call obese. Maybe there was someone who might still say that of me. But I was way too heavy, and I knew that I had to lose weight. It was not good for my health. It was not good for my view of life. I was actually starting to be, I wasn't actually lying on a couch, but maybe I was on the verge of being a couch-based life.
You didn't like yourself very much.
And no, it was a case of you discover that you don't like yourself very much at that point for various reasons. And so I suddenly decided, well, what if I could actually not have a massive loss of weight? What if I could just lose 2 kilograms?
Yeah.
And so I set myself a task. I'll do that. And then at the time I was 118 kilograms, and so I thought, well, let's get down to 115. And then I thought, well, what about 107? For some obscure reason, that seemed a good figure to go to. And one reason or other, I got myself there. And then I set myself the goal, what about 100? I won't ever go beyond that. I won't be able to do that. Well, I ended up at 92. But one of the things that it required was, first of all, this attitude that small steps,
Yeah.
but then changing in that Gestalt kind of way, the way you see things. And one of the Gestalts that made a difference for me was the feeling of hunger in the stomach. For most of us, most of the time, hunger in the stomach says, I'm hungry, I've got to eat. I changed the way I saw a pain of hunger into being a sensation in the stomach. Oh, my stomach's telling me it's feeling hungry. That's interesting. It is, after all, just a sensation. So I'm not going to cater to it now. I'll cater to it when I'm ready.
But you aren't someone who would think something out like that. It's much easier to, from the sofa, reach for the donut.
Yeah, sure. But I remember at the time there was a young couple who was pretty impressed with what I was doing, and they were struggling with it. And I actually mentioned this business about how you see or how you feel, what you interpret, the sensation, not the pain of hunger, the sensation of hunger.
It.
And that meant something to them. It actually helped them change the way they went about.
Well, I think that someone watching this may try the small steps which you've talked about and have a look at why they're hungry. It's a very good piece of advice. More difficult, I think, is just, I'd like to touch on violence in the home. There's a lot of people who are watching this and they're on the end of someone who's violent to them, gender-based violence, whatever country it is. And they love the person, they're fond of the person, but they think it's time to go. So, because they feel that person is not going to change, so the situation is stuck. What are you going to say about that?
Domestic violence, it can be gender-based, it can be just generational-based within a family. You can have the next generation being violently treated by an older generation. And there are situations where one can hope with the appropriate provision of support that a family can stay together, but there are other situations where frankly that cannot happen. They simply have to evacuate the problem, leave, because it's not going to be dealt with safely by the people in the situation. But again, one has to understand, evacuate the potential victims from a situation, certainly, but don't leave the perpetrator without some tools of help.
Well, why do you say that? It's up to him, not up to you.
Might be up to her.
But
yeah.
Well, why? Go on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'm saying evacuate the people who need protection, but if you just leave that person untreated, unaddressed, they will go on being violent in other situations.
Yes.
Point one. So at the very least, from some kind of self-interest for others who may come in their path, we need to deal with their problem. The second one is that their problem may have some genesis that is pretty awful too. We talk about violence feeding itself on generationally. A person's violent because they were violently treated by their parents, who were violently treated by their parents. When are you going to break that cycle? Unless you actually try to address both the perpetrator as well as the victim.
Well, the perpetrator may or may not want to change and
Absolutely,
may be
that's
very
true.
stuck, quite happily abusing someone else, but I doubt he is actually happy, but it's what he knows.
Sure, I'm not suggesting this is an easy task. I'm just saying to you that I think the domestic violence situation needs proper support for the victims, but also don't forget the perpetrator.
So I want you to give, for people watching who are really, they've had enough of being stuck, they're not sure which way to go, they don't feel they've got the courage, I want you to say something that actually might make a change in their lives.
Well, one of the prayers, we talked about prayer, one of the prayers that I pray every day when I wake up is, God, thank you for the gift of this new day. You did not have to give it to me, you did. I thank you for it and pray that I may use it usefully. And by that I mean is that God didn't have to wake me up. I could have died in my sleep, but rather he has allowed me to wake up, and I'm looking at a new day, not yesterday or the time past. I'm looking at a new day which is mine to make of it what I will. Yes, I carry with me the baggage on my back of the problems I'm facing, and I'm carrying baggage, others are carrying baggage, I get that. But the new day offers me the chance to look at it in a different way.
not shed the baggage, but see it differently.
See it differently, and then in the process maybe you do shed some. I actually preached recently on the dark night of the soul. In the middle of the night I can sometimes wake up and be overwhelmed with the baggage on my back, and I pray to God to help me clear it up and see it better. But when I then fall asleep and wake up, I pray this prayer.
Well, it's a wonderful prayer. Lynn, thank you very much for talking to us. For Here to Talk viewers, we're going to give people a chance to say what you think of me and Lynn and the whole thing, because there's a lot there, and of course you may still be wanting to find a way out of the stuckness, and what Lynn says may, I hope, have helped. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.